A simple walk turns into a life-changing moment when a cop wrongly accuses a black man of loitering, only to discover he's the new police chief. Watch as this powerful moment exposes bias, sparks change, and shows that true leadership is about fairness and respect for everyone. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now let's get started. Malik Thomas, in his mid-30s, was a man of quiet strength. He had spent years working tirelessly to combat injustice in his community, fighting for equality and fairness at every turn. His calm demeanor and sharp mind had earned him the respect of his peers. But Malik was no stranger to the struggles of the communities he served. Coming from humble beginnings, he understood the challenges faced by people who often felt forgotten by those in power. His promotion to police chief was not just a career milestone. It was the culmination of years of dedication to making a real difference. Recently appointed as the new police chief of a city known for its deep racial tension, Malik was acutely aware of the weight his position carried. People were watching. They had high expectations, not just for his leadership, but for his ability to bridge the gap between the police force and the communities they served. Malik knew that this wasn't going to be an easy task, but he was determined to make it work. On this particular day, dressed in plain clothes, Malik decided to step out into the community to see the city through the eyes of its residents. He wasn't there in his official capacity as police chief. He was just a man walking down a busy street, blending in with the crowd. The sounds of the city, cars honking, people chatting, the distant hum of the hustle surrounded him, but Malik remained focused. He wasn't just walking. He was observing, listening, and trying to understand the pulse of the community he now led. Malik was walking down the busy street, taking in the sounds of the city. The chatter of pedestrians, the rhythmic hum of traffic, and the distant clang of a street performer's drum filled the air. He had been here countless times before, but today was different. Today he was trying to see the city through fresh eyes. He wasn't Malik Thomas, the newly appointed police chief, just a man walking down the street like anyone else. As he passed by a cafe, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps quickening behind him. Before he could turn around, a voice barked at him, sharp and demanding. "Hey, hold on a second." Malik turned to find a white police officer standing a few feet away. The officer's stance was rigid, his hand resting on his holstered gun. Malik's mind briefly registered the sudden shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't a routine interaction. The officer's eyes were scanning him, sizing him up in a way that immediately felt off. "Can I help you, officer?" Malik asked, his voice calm but firm, trying to assess the situation. "You're walking around here looking suspicious," the officer said, his tone filled with authority. "I'm going to need to ask you a few questions." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious?" he asked, his voice steady. "I'm just walking home. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, his posture becoming more confrontational. "Suspicious behavior's enough. I'm going to have to arrest you for loitering." Malik took a slow breath. His mind flashed to his position, his purpose, and his commitment to fairness. He knew what this could mean. He knew the tensions in the city, and he understood that a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time could be treated unfairly. But Malik was no stranger to adversity. He had spent years fighting against it. "I'm the new police chief," Malik said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I've just been appointed to the position. I'm here trying to get a feel for the community." The officer's face flickered with disbelief. "You're the police chief?" he asked, his voice incredulous, as if it didn't even register. "Yeah," Malik confirmed, standing his ground. "I'm Malik Thomas, the new chief. I'm just trying to get out in the community, not in uniform. No need to arrest me." The officer didn't seem to hear him. I don't care who you are, Officer Daniels said, his voice tightening with irritation. You're loitering and I'm placing you under arrest. Malik's heart rate increased, but his face remained calm. He couldn't allow himself to escalate this situation. I'm trying to explain. There's no need to do this. I'm not doing anything wrong. But the officer's eyes were cold, and he was resolute. He took a step forward, placing his hand on Malik's arm. It doesn't matter who you say you are. I'm arresting you for loitering. Step over here. Malik stood still, his mind racing. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a clear case of racial profiling. He had been stopped simply because of how he looked, because he was a black man in an area where the officer had assumed he didn't belong. Malik wasn't a criminal, and he wasn't going to let this officer make him feel like one. Do you really want to go down this road? Malik asked, his voice low but steady. You're going to arrest me for loitering when I'm the new police chief? Officer Daniels hesitated for a moment, but then he snapped, his hand tightening on Malik's arm. I don't care who you are. You're coming with me. Malik stayed calm, but inside, he was seething. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. He had worked so hard to get to this point, to bring change to a system that so desperately needed it, and now, this officer, in all his ignorance, was trying to strip away the very dignity that Malik had worked his whole life to uphold. Go ahead, Malik said quietly, meeting the officer's gaze with an unwavering calm. But I'm not going down without making sure this gets fixed. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, some reaching for their phones, others whispering in disbelief. The officer's grip loosened slightly as the weight of the situation began to sink in, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down just yet. The standoff continued, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the last step in this story. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with the weight of something bigger than the situation itself. Officer Daniels, his hand still gripping Malik's arm, stood rigid and unwavering, as if his authority was unchallengeable. Malik, however, remained composed, his face calm despite the injustice of it all. He wasn't just a man standing there, he was a symbol of change, of the hope that one day things would be different. But here, in this moment, it felt like everything he had worked for was being dismissed with a single, thoughtless action. The officer, clearly unwilling to back down, leaned in closer, his eyes narrowed. I told you already you're under arrest. No more talking. Get in the car. Malik's chest tightened as Officer Daniels's tone grew more forceful, but he refused to let the situation escalate any further. He had to stay calm. His every instinct told him to challenge this officer, to demand respect, but Malik understood the power of patience. He wasn't just representing himself in this moment. He was representing everything he had worked for, everything that had led him to this position. He couldn't afford to give in to anger. Officer, you're making a mistake, Malik said, his voice still even, though there was an edge to it now. I'm the new police chief. I'm here to serve the community. You don't need to do this. I've done nothing wrong. At the sound of those words, something shifted in the air. The officer hesitated, his face flickering with confusion for just a split second. But then, as if determined to prove something, his jaw tightened, and his grip on Malik's arm grew harder. I don't care who you think you are, Officer Daniels snapped. You're loitering, and I'm not going to let you walk away from this. Malik's heart began to race. His patience was wearing thin, but he wasn't about to show it. He had to remain in control. The last thing he wanted was for the situation to escalate further, especially in front of a growing crowd. But that's when the murmurs began, slowly at first, and then louder, until the whispers turned into full conversations. People were noticing, and they weren't just watching, they were questioning. Is that guy really arresting him? One voice said from the crowd. What's going on here? Another asked, a hint of disbelief in their tone. Malik could hear them, feel their eyes on him, but he didn't let it distract him. He stayed focused on the officer. He had to make this right, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly like this. A young woman from the crowd stepped forward, holding up her phone, the screen glowing bright. "I'm recording this," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "People need to see this." Officer Daniels didn't seem to notice the camera at first, but when he did, his posture stiffened even more, and his eyes darted toward the woman. "Put that phone down," he ordered sharply. The woman didn't flinch. "I have every right to record this," she replied. "What's happening isn't right." That was all it took. Once the phone came out, the crowd's energy shifted. More people began to gather, many pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation. The officer's authority, once unchallenged, now seemed under a microscope. Malik took a deep breath, his eyes moving from the officer to the faces in the crowd. He could see the uncertainty in their expressions, the hesitation in their gazes. They weren't sure what was happening, but they knew something wasn't right. The officer had no solid explanation, no reason for his actions. "You can't arrest someone for no reason," another voice called out from the crowd, this time a man standing a few feet away. "What's going on here?" Malik seized the opportunity, his voice steady but louder this time. "I'm not resisting. I'm just telling you the truth. I'm the new police chief of this city. I've just been appointed, and I'm out here trying to understand the community I'm supposed to serve. I'm not the one breaking the law here." The officer's face flushed with irritation. "I don't care who you are. You can't just walk around like you own the place." His words were starting to lose their authority, their conviction, as the crowd's eyes turned to him, their scrutiny growing sharper. Malik looked at the officer and then at the crowd. He could see people shaking their heads, some whispering among themselves, others still recording. He could feel the officer's discomfort now, could see the cracks forming in his confidence. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was becoming a public spectacle, and Malik wasn't about to let the officer's biases define this moment. "Officer," Malik said again, keeping his voice calm but firm, "you don't get to decide who's suspicious just based on how someone looks. You don't know me. You don't know who I am or what I've done for this city. You don't get to treat people this way because of the color of their skin. That's not what this city should stand for." Officer Daniels's face twitched. He clearly didn't know how to handle being challenged so openly, especially with so many witnesses now around him. His hands shook slightly, but he quickly masked it with anger. "Move along," he barked at the crowd. "This doesn't concern you." But the crowd wasn't moving. More people had gathered now, and the air was thick with tension, the sound of chatter filling the space between Malik and the officer. It wasn't just Malik against the officer anymore. It was the people watching, seeing something they knew wasn't right. "Why don't you let him go?" a man in the crowd said. "What are you really arresting him for?" Malik stood still, his eyes focused on Officer Daniels. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to let this officer's biases dictate how this moment ended. He could feel the weight of the situation, the gaze of everyone in the crowd, but he didn't break his composure. "I'm just walking home," Malik said. "That's all. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer stood there, caught between his own pride and the pressure of the crowd's stares. He was losing control, and everyone could see it. But it wasn't just about this one officer. It was about something much larger, something that had been wrong for a long time. The murmurs grew louder, and Malik could sense the change in the crowd's energy. They were starting to question the officer's judgment, his motives. Malik wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had been treated unfairly, for every single person who had been seen as suspicious because of their race. The tension in the air didn't disappear, but it shifted. Officer Daniels knew this wasn't just going to go away, not this time. The air was thick with tension, the hum of murmurs rippling through the crowd like an electric current. Officer Daniels stood with his hand still gripping Malik's arm, his stance rigid with authority, but now the power dynamic had shifted. Malik's calm defiance and the growing chorus of voices questioning the officer's judgment had left the situation hanging in the balance. The officer, despite the pressure mounting around him, seemed determined to assert his control, but the shift was undeniable. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were becoming participants in this moment. The video footage that many had already started recording now held the promise of accountability, and the officer seemed to feel the weight of it. Malik, ever poised, stood tall, refusing to let the officer's aggression rattle him. It was then that someone in the crowd shouted, "That's Malik Thomas! He's the new police chief!" The words hit like a thunderclap, shattering the tension that had been building for the last few minutes. Everything seemed to freeze for a moment. Officer Daniels, still gripping Malik's arm, looked up in disbelief, his eyes scanning the crowd. The murmurs grew louder as people turned to get a closer look. The officer's face went pale as the realization dawned on him. Malik Thomas, the man he had just accused of loitering, the man he had just attempted to arrest for no reason, was, in fact, the very person he was supposed to respect and answer to, the new police chief. For a brief moment, it felt like the world stood still. The officer's grip on Malik's arm loosened as his mind raced. His eyes darted between Malik and the growing crowd, the full weight of his actions beginning to sink in. The realization wasn't just a personal embarrassment, it was a professional disaster. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with, and now the truth was staring him right in the face. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a mix of disbelief and shock. "The police chief?" someone whispered. "How could he not know?" another person muttered, shaking their head. Malik stood there, his expression calm, unwavering. The crowd had fallen silent now, each person waiting to see what would happen next. Malik could feel the eyes on him, but he didn't let the moment overwhelm him. He wasn't just a man standing in front of an officer, he was a man standing for change, for equality, and for the community he had sworn to protect. Slowly, Malik pulled his arm free from the officer's loose grip. He looked directly into Officer Daniels's eyes. "You should have listened," Malik said, his voice steady but firm. "I told you who I was." The officer took a small step back, his face flushed with embarrassment. His eyes flickered nervously as he searched for the right words, but they failed him. I didn't know," he stammered, clearly caught off guard. His gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his actions was finally sinking in. Malik took a step forward, his voice calm but carrying the full force of the moment. "I've been appointed to bring change, Officer Daniels. I'm here to make sure everyone in this city is treated fairly, no matter their skin color, no matter where they come from. But you've made a mistake. Not just by not recognizing me, but by assuming I didn't belong here, that I was some random person to be dismissed. People like me are tired of being judged by the color of our skin and not by the content of our character." The officer remained silent, his eyes now fixed on the ground, unable to meet Malik's gaze. The crowd was watching closely, their eyes filled with judgment and disbelief at the officer's behavior. Some whispered among themselves, still processing the shock of what had just happened. The woman with the phone, who had been recording the entire scene, stepped forward. She caught Malik's eye and nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're doing the right thing." Malik gave a brief nod of acknowledgement, but his focus remained on Officer Daniels. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about what his leadership represented, the promise that things could be different, that the system could change if those who had the power to make a difference were willing to stand up and do so. "Officer," Malik continued, his voice unwavering, "I understand this was a mistake, but it's a mistake that could have cost me far more than my dignity. You've treated me like a suspect simply because of my appearance, and that's not okay." It never will be. He took another step forward, his presence commanding but not intimidating. The crowd was still watching, the air still heavy, but Malik's words carried the weight of truth. "This is not just about me, and it's not just about you," Malik said. "This is about a system that treats people differently, not because of their actions, but because of their race. I'm not going to let that stand. And you, Officer Daniels, should take this as a lesson that no one, no matter their title or position, should ever be treated like this. Not now, not ever." Malik's voice rang out, clear and resolute. "And now, it's time to start making real change." Officer Daniels, his face still red from the shock, nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he muttered, the words coming out hoarse, as if the weight of his actions had finally hit him. But the apology felt hollow. The damage had been done. The system had failed, and it was now up to people like Malik to ensure it didn't happen again. As the crowd began to disperse, some still murmuring in disbelief, Malik turned to walk away, his posture strong. His identity was no longer hidden, and the truth had been revealed, not just to Officer Daniels, but to everyone who had witnessed this moment. Malik had shown the power of patience, the strength of calm in the face of injustice, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. He wasn't just the new police chief. He was a man on a mission to ensure that people in his city, no matter their race, would never be treated this way again. And as the crowd slowly faded behind him, Malik knew that the real work was only just beginning. Officer Daniels stood there, utterly stunned, his face still pale with embarrassment. He shifted from foot to foot, his usual confidence replaced by discomfort. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. He had acted in haste, assuming the worst of a man he didn't know, a man who was now standing before him, showing him what real leadership, patience, and dignity looked like. I'm sorry," Officer Daniels stammered, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes flickered nervously between Malik and the growing crowd, which had started to disperse but still observed with cautious curiosity. The video that had been recorded was now making its rounds on social media, spreading quickly with the hashtag number Justice for Malik. His apology felt small in the face of what he had done. He knew that. Malik stood still, his expression calm but firm, his gaze never leaving the officer. He could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him, and it wasn't about the officer either. This was about every person who had been wrongly judged, every person who had been treated unfairly because of their race, their status, or how they were perceived by others. "I appreciate your apology, officer," Malik said, his voice even. "But it's not enough." The words hung in the air, and the officer looked up, confusion and guilt written on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but Malik raised a hand to stop him. "An apology is just words," Malik continued, his tone still steady, but with an undeniable undercurrent of disappointment. "It's easy to say you're sorry when you're caught, but the real change doesn't happen with a few words. It happens with actions. It happens when we stop judging people based on how they look and start judging them for who they really are." Malik took a step closer, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You didn't stop me because of anything I did, officer. You stopped me because of how I looked. Because you assumed that a black man walking through this neighborhood must be up to no good. You assumed my worth based on my appearance, not on my character. And that's where the problem lies." The officer's shoulders slumped as he stood there, processing Malik's words. He didn't know what to say. All he could do was nod, as if trying to accept the weight of the truth that was being laid bare before him. Malik wasn't finished. "I've been a cop for years, officer. I've seen the ugly side of this profession. I've seen how easy it is to treat people differently when you don't take the time to truly see them. And I've seen how devastating it can be when that judgment is based on nothing more than the color of someone's skin." The officer's face flushed with shame. I didn't mean it like that, he muttered, almost to himself. I know you didn't, Malik replied softly, but firmly. But that's the problem, isn't it? We don't mean to treat people unfairly, but too often we do. We carry biases with us, without even realizing it, and we act on them. That's the first step we need to fix. We need to start looking beyond the surface and seeing people for who they truly are. Officer Daniels seemed to shrink under Malik's steady gaze. He knew Malik was right. His actions had been fueled by something deeper, something he had never fully acknowledged in himself. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just caught in the act of racial profiling. He was part of the very system that perpetuated it. His embarrassment turned into guilt, and the weight of the situation bore down on him. Malik stepped back slightly, giving the officer space to process the conversation, but he wasn't done. The real change, Officer Daniels, starts when we hold ourselves accountable, when we recognize that our behavior impacts not only the people we're interacting with, but also the entire community we're supposed to protect. And I'm going to make sure that everyone who wears this uniform understands that, especially moving forward. The officer's eyes widened. He swallowed hard, the words Malik had spoken sinking in. It wasn't just about his mistake now. It was about the bigger picture. It was about how he and the rest of the police force treated every person they came across. And it was about understanding that their actions mattered, whether or not they were caught on camera. I will make sure every officer who works under my command understands that, Officer Daniels, Malik continued, his voice unwavering. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to make sure this never happens again, not just to me, but to anyone. And I'm going to hold every officer accountable for how they treat people in this city. The officer stood there, silently absorbing the gravity of Malik's words. A part of him wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he knew deep down that there was no excuse for his actions. He had been wrong, and he couldn't undo it. I understand, he said quietly, his voice strained. I won't let it happen again. Malik nodded. I hope that you don't. Because the people who we are meant to protect deserve better than what you gave me today. We all need to do better. And it starts with us. There was a long pause between them. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but the lingering tension was palpable. Malik's resolve had softened the officer's stance, and there was no denying the shift that had occurred in the air. As Malik turned to walk away, he looked back at Officer Daniels one last time. I'll be watching. Not as your chief, but as someone who believes in the promise of justice. You'll be held to that same standard, just like everyone else. The officer nodded again, his face pale but now filled with understanding. For the first time, he seemed to fully grasp the weight of his actions. Malik's footsteps echoed in the quiet street, each step a reminder of the change he was determined to bring, not just to the police department but to the whole community. This was only one small moment in a long journey ahead, but for Malik it was a start, and that, he knew, was what mattered most. As Malik walked away, his heart was heavy with the weight of the work still to come. But it was lighter than it had been moments before. He had made a difference in that officer's life, and perhaps, just perhaps, that difference would ripple out into the community. The real work was just beginning, but Malik was ready to lead, ready to make the change he had always believed was possible. Malik returned to his position as police chief with a renewed sense of purpose. The walk down the street, the confrontation with Officer Daniels, and the conversation that followed were not just an isolated incident, they were a turning point, not only for Malik, but for the entire city. The events of that day had sent shockwaves through the community, and as Malik stepped back into his office, he knew the work ahead would be challenging, but it was also necessary. The news of the confrontation spread quickly. Word got out about the officer's mistake, the public reaction, and Malik's calm, firm stance. People were talking, on social media, in the streets, at community meetings. Some were angry, some were in disbelief, and many were grateful. But one thing was clear: the incident had opened a door for change. The city, long divided by racial tension, began to have the conversations it had avoided for too long. Malik was asked to speak at town halls and public forums, addressing the community and the department directly. And while the questions were difficult, Malik answered them with the honesty and transparency that he had promised himself from the very beginning. "Racial profiling is real," Malik said at one of these meetings, his voice unwavering. "I've seen it firsthand. I've felt it too. But it's not something that can be swept under the rug any longer. This city deserves better, and I'm going to make sure that everyone, no matter their race, is treated with dignity and respect." Malik didn't just talk about change. He started implementing it. He launched mandatory bias training for every officer in the department, making it clear that prejudice in any form would not be tolerated. He restructured the hiring process, emphasizing diversity and community involvement. Malik also set up community policing initiatives that focused on building trust between the police and residents. Officers were encouraged to spend more time in the neighborhoods they served, not as enforcers, but as allies, people who understood the struggles and the strengths of the community they protected. For Malik, it wasn't enough to just make reforms. It was about making people feel seen and heard. He reached out to community leaders, activists, and parents, and asked them to be a part of the conversation. Malik wanted to create a bridge, a connection between the people and the police that had been missing for so long. The story of the incident on the street became a symbol of hope. Malik's actions that day, his calm, his refusal to be intimidated, his unwavering belief in fairness, showed that leadership required more than authority. It required empathy. It required the ability to see the humanity in others, even when they may not see it in you. And it required the willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been ignored for too long. His leadership inspired others to speak up, both inside the police department and in the community. Officers who had witnessed Malik's calm and conviction began to question their own biases, their own behavior. Many of them came forward, willing to learn and grow alongside him. The community, too, found its voice. People who had once felt powerless began to demand more from their leaders, more from their police force, and more from themselves. And the most important change was in the young people of the city, the children, the teenagers, the ones who had seen the same kind of treatment that Malik had experienced. For the first time, they felt like they had someone in a position of power who understood their struggles, who saw them for who they were and not for the color of their skin. They began to dream bigger, knowing that their dreams weren't limited by the prejudices of others. The city started to heal. Slowly but surely, the rifts that had divided it for so long began to close. People who had once feared the police began to trust them again. The streets were still full of challenges, but now there was hope that things could be different, that people could work together, that justice could be served, and that change was possible. Malik stood in front of the city's people at a rally one evening, the sun setting behind him, painting the sky in warm hues. He looked out over the crowd, families, children, people from all walks of life, and smiled. "The work is far from over," he said, his voice filled with hope. "But we've taken the first step, and together we'll keep moving forward. We'll build a future where fairness and justice are for everyone, no matter who they are." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets, the sounds of unity and hope ringing out. Malik knew that change would not come overnight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility. He had helped to plant the seeds for something greater, a future where people could live, work, and grow together in mutual respect. And that, he knew, was just the beginning. Malik's journey doesn't end with this incident. While it marked a pivotal moment, his story is one of ongoing resilience and transformative change. Through his unwavering patience, strong leadership, and undeniable courage, he made a lasting impact on his community, proving that standing up for justice is not just about one moment, but about dedicating yourself to change every single day. Malik showed that leadership requires more than authority. It demands empathy, the ability to listen, and the courage to challenge the status quo. Even in the face of adversity, he refused to be silenced, using his position not to wield power over others, but to lift them up. His actions served as a reminder that real change isn't easy. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it requires people to be brave enough to face the truth and make difficult choices. Through his work, Malik inspired others to rise above their biases, to see one another for who they truly were, and to work toward a future where fairness and equality were not privileges, but guarantees. His story proves that change is possible, not just through big moments, but through the small daily acts of kindness, understanding, and leadership that shape the world around us. Malik's journey will continue to inspire generations to come, showing them that standing up for what's right, no matter the challenge, is always worth it.